Good evening to all and welcome to Byju's. This is Basavaraj and we'll be continuing the ecology and environment, what we have stopped yesterday or from where we have stopped yesterday. Hope I am audible as well as visible to you all. Just please confirm me that I'm audible. Good evening to all. Good evening to all. Right. Right. Done. Good evening. Good evening to all. Okay. So we were discussing about the impact of the global warming and climate change, where we discussed the impact of cyclones. And every time you can expect the questions based on the cyclones or based on the impact of the climate change. So you should be making notes on the impact of climate change on the cyclone. You should be making the impact of climate change on the cyclones. Why? Because if you take India is affected by both type of cyclones. The coastal area of India is affected by tropical cyclone, and the northwestern part of India is affected by the western disturbances or temperate cyclone. Northwestern part of India is affected by temperate cyclone, or we refer that as the western disturbances. Right, we refer that as western disturbances. Is that clear? So this is some rough idea about the cyclones, the tropical cyclones and temperate cyclones. And the tropical cyclones have increased in the number, they have increased in the intensity, and they have also becoming rapid intensification. It means they are gaining the strength very, very fast in less than 24 hours. Then temperate cyclones are also becoming dangerous. That is, they are acquiring more steep pressure gradient, and that is why they are also becoming more dangerous one. And we refer that as bomb cyclone or bombogenesis, which we have seen in European part and part of Eastern America. Right. So this is some rough idea about the tropical cyclones and temperate cyclones. Regarding morning batch, I don't know. I'll just check and I'll ask them to intimate you. I'll ask them to communicate regarding the morning batch. Right. So just focus on this class. So I'll ask them to communicate to you regarding the morning batch. Done. So now the impact of climate change, we have to see in how it makes an impact on the 75% of the water bodies or 70% of the water body called as oceans. What is the impact of climate change on the oceans? Now here you should understand, due to the impact of global warming, large amount of carbon dioxide enters into the ocean. And oceans are referred as major carbon sink. Oceans are referred as major carbon sink. Right. Now, what happens when carbon dioxide enters into the oceans? Now, whenever the carbon dioxide enters into the oceans, so this carbon dioxide is having heating effect. This carbon dioxide has heating effect. It increases the temperature. The temperature of the ocean water increases. Now, what happens when the temperature of ocean water increases? The first aspect is it expands. When the temperature of ocean water increases, the water expands. Water expands. Now, when the water expands, what will happen to the sea level? The water level will increase, which will lead to submergence of coastal area. So this will lead to increase in the water level, or sea level will increase. And this will lead to submergence of the coastal area. Submergence of coastal area. This is one aspect of increasing temperature. Now, what happens in other way? So again, when the carbon dioxide enters into the ocean water, the temperature increases. Now, as the temperature increases, the oxygen holding capacity of water decreases. The oxygen holding capacity, oxygen holding capacity of the water decreases. When the temperature increases, its oxygen holding capacity decreases. And such waters where the oxygen concentration decreases, we refer that as hypoxia. Hypoxia, where the water will have low concentration of oxygen. Low concentration of oxygen, we refer that as hypoxia. Now, as there is a shortage of oxygen in the water, then that will create suffocation to the marine organism. So that will create suffocation and uncomfortable to the marine organism or marine species. So that will lead to death of large amount of marine species. So this will lead to death of marine species, death of many marine species, and this is referred as, or this creates what we call it as a dead zone. So this is referred as a dead zone. And remember, this dead zone is the dead zone which is due to the impact of climate change. So this dead zone is due to impact of climate change. Due to impact of climate change. We refer that as dead zone, right? So dead zones can be created two ways: one due to pollution and one due to the climate change. So when I take pollution, I'll explain how that is created, what is the eutrophication and how that eutrophication leads to dead zone. So here the dead zone is created by deficiency of oxygen in the water. So this decrease in the oxygen level in the ocean water or in any sea, the animal species, the marine species, they will die because of suffocation. And we refer that as the anoxia induced or climate change induced dead zone. So this is climate change induced dead zone. Climate change induced dead zone. This is very important. Now, the third aspect of the carbon dioxide. So generally, if you see the pH value of ocean water, the average pH value of ocean water is 8.2. Average is 8.2. Now, when the carbon dioxide enters into the ocean, so this carbon dioxide, it reacts with the ocean water, that is hydrogen part, and it converts into mild carbonic acid. Mild carbonic acid. And we refer this as acidification of ocean. We refer this as acidification. Ocean acidification. Now, whenever this mild carbonic acid is seen, now there will be a decreasing trend in the pH values. The pH value do not fall below 7. The pH value do not fall below 7. So this pH value shows a decreasing tendency. Decreasing tendency. If the same process continues, then maybe by end of this century, this pH value may reach to somewhere around 8. Or if it is persisting, then it may reach to 7.9 or 7.8. So this pH value will show a decreasing tendency. Acidification does not mean that the ocean water pH value will be less than 7. It does not mean it will be less than 7, but it will be lesser than 8.2. It can be 7.9, it can be 8, but not below 7. Is it clear? But when there is an acidification, it will affect It will affect the calcareous skeletons. So corals will be affected. Corals will be affected. Their hard calcareous skeleton will be affected, right? So their skeletons, their larvae will be affected due to the aspect of acidification, as their skeletons are made up of calcium carbonate, CaCO3. So hence, due to acidification, their skeletons will become soft and their larva can be affected, right? So this is what the impact of the climate change on the oceans, that is sea level increases due to increasing of its expansion. Second one is it can create a dead zone. Third one is something which is associated with the coral aspect. Now fourth one, which is very significant, and it is in the current affairs. In the context of ocean, we refer them as ocean currents. The ocean currents which plays an important role. And this ocean currents which is seen in the context of oceans is due to two factors, that is temperature as well as salinity. And this ocean circuit or ocean current is referred as thermohaline circulation. It is thermohaline circulation. Thermohaline circulation. It means that this ocean current is based on density, and this density is the factor of temperature and salinity. This density of ocean water is the factor of temperature and salinity. Combined factor of temperature and salinity. So this combined factor of temperature and salinity defines the density of ocean water. And this density of ocean water is something which makes the horizontal as well as vertical movement of ocean water. Horizontal as well as vertical movement of ocean water. Thermohaline circulation. So this is what the ocean currents and its mechanism is seen. This is thermohaline circulation. Apart from winds, thermohaline circulation is referred. Now, in the context of oceans, you have seen the ocean currents are there in the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, and then also in the Arctic Ocean. So this ocean water moves from one ocean to another ocean. So this ocean water, it moves from one ocean to another ocean, ocean to ocean. It moves from ocean to ocean, right? And when we talk about this, this takes thousands of years. This takes thousands of years. Thousands of years. And this passage of movement of ocean water from Atlantic Ocean to Indian Ocean and then to Pacific Ocean, Atlantic to Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, we refer this as a global conveyor belt. Global conveyor belt, where it takes thousands of years to make the water to move from Atlantic Ocean again to the Indian Ocean, to the Pacific Ocean, and again coming back. And in this global conveyor belt, a very significant is what we refer that as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current. So we have something called as AMOC. This is Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current. Overturning current. And this AMOC is part of global conveyor belt. It is part of the global conveyor belt. And this AMOC, it starts from the Gulf Stream. So it is from the Gulf Stream. Which transfers the warm water from equator towards the poles and the cold water from poles towards the equator. So it transfers the warm water from equator towards the poles equator towards the poles, and then cold water from the poles towards the equator, and cold water from poles towards the equator. Warm water reaches, it subsides, then it comes back. Now, the reason for its subsistence is density. The reason for its subsistence. So here we find the water reaches and then it moves downward. It moves downward, right? So this Atlantic meridional current, at this stage, it subsides. It downwells. It moves downward. So the water moves downward, or downwelling is seen. Why? Because of density. It moves downward because of density. Density, right? Now, if you see the impact of global warming and climate change, due to global warming and climate change, we find the melting of glaciers have increased. The melting of ice has increased, and this has added more fresh water. This has added fresh water. Fresh water. And this fresh water which has added, has affected the density. And hence, there may be possibility that this amok can reduce its speed. So this can impact on the speed of Atlantic meridional overturning current. Atlantic meridional overturning current. And this will reduce the movement of ocean currents. So this will reduce the movement of ocean currents. Movement. Right. Now, what happens when the movement of ocean current is reduced? So it means that the water will become somewhat stagnant. The water will become somewhat stagnant. Or there is possibility that amok may collapse, or amok may collapse. May collapse. Now, when the amok collapses, when it stops working, then the warm water from the equator, which can reach to the poles, decreases. So it means that the polar regions will become colder and colder. So this will make the polar region more colder. Polar, that is the Eurasia. So this region will become more colder and colder because that brings warm water here. So this region will become warmer. So this area where the warm water reaches. So due to the collapsing of the Atlantic meridional current, so this region will become very cold. Complete cold areas. So sometimes it may be filled with the ice in that areas. So the polar areas will become more colder. More colder. Right. And this in turn can affect the global conveyor belt. So if this in turn can affect, it will affect the global conveyor belt. And as the global conveyor belt is affected, it will affect the entire biodiversity of ocean. So it will affect the biodiversity of ocean. Biodiversity is destroyed, and the fishing grounds can also be disturbed, because best fishing grounds are the areas where warm and cold ocean currents are there, where we find upwelling of waters are there. If you take Peru is best fishing ground because of upwelling of water, right? And when warm and cold currents meets, so that becomes the best fishing ground. So it will affect fishing activities. So fishing activities will be disturbed. Activity will be disturbed, right? So these are the ways in which the impact of climate change is seen in the context of what we refer them as the ocean currents and the climate change, which affects the density of ocean water. Is it clear? So density of ocean water, right? So when you are reading about the impact of the climate change, a separate question can be asked: impact of climate change on cyclones, impact of climate change on the ocean. Separate question can be asked for 15 marks. So this is how the impact of climate change is seen in the oceans. Is it clear? And then this is what we refer them as the impact of ocean currents on the entire part. So generally, the ocean water moves from Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean and again to the Indian Ocean. It is a continuous movement of ocean water, but very slow. We refer that as a global conveyor belt. The water which is moving in the global ocean. If you have read your geography, all the oceans, Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, all these oceans combinedly, we refer that as global ocean. And the water moving from one ocean to another ocean very slowly in thousands of years, we refer that as the global conveyor belt. And this global conveyor belt starts from a reference point called as Gulf Stream in the Atlantic Ocean. So it starts from this point. We refer that as Gulf Stream. Strong Gulf Stream is very strong movement of water from where the water moves from the eastern part of America, right? So this is called as the Gulf Stream. And from this reference point, we say that as Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, AMOC, which starts from Gulf Stream. And this Gulf Stream carries the warm water towards the poles, and then after that, it descends down and the cold water moves back to the equator. So this is a continuous process which is due to density as well as temperature. We refer that as thermohaline circulation. We refer this as thermohaline circulation. And due to the impact of climate change, when the melting of glacier is there, fresh water enters into the ocean, which affects the density. The water becomes less denser, and that is where the ocean currents sinking reduces. The ocean current becomes almost all stagnant, and that makes maybe that AMOC may collapse or it may stop, and that is where it can have an impact. So this is what your current affairs is, AMOC and also its impacts. So now all the data says that Atlantic Meridional Ocean current is reducing, right? AMOC is very important. So if this AMOC collapses, then entire oceans on the earth will be affected. Not only Atlantic, entire oceans will be affected very, very slowly, right? Next is due to impact of climate change and the global warming, we find the heat waves and cold waves. They have increased in both intensity as well as severity. So they have increased in both intensity and frequency. Intensity means they are becoming very severe. So initially the heat waves where the heat would not have been scorching heats. Now we find the temperatures have been increasing to very high. The temperatures are reaching to very high. So they are becoming very, very severe. Even the cold waves, they are becoming very, very extreme. So we find extreme conditions are reaching. Extreme heat waves are there, extreme cold waves are also there. Now here we find they are not only becoming extremes, their time has also increased. Initially they were for 10 days, 15 days. Now their duration has also increased. Duration is also increased, and often they are appearing. So their numbers have also increased. Is that clear? So heat waves and cold waves, they have become extreme, they have become severe, they have become intense, and their numbers are also increasing. We refer them as the frequencies have increased, right? And the same place is affected by heat waves and cold waves. Take an example of Delhi. If you take an example of Delhi, so this Delhi, at present, it is affected by heat waves. Then again, in the month of November, December, it is affected by the cold waves. So the same area is affected by heat waves, and the same area is affected by the cold waves due to apparent shifting of the sun. But the conditions are becoming very, very extreme and severe. Is it clear? Now, something called as ice calving. Ice calving means breaking a part of ice. Breaking a part of ice. a part of ice in the ice shelf, right? In the ice shelf. Now here we find that due to the impact of the climate change, carbon dioxide is entering into ocean. It is entering into the ocean, where it is making the water warm from inside. Warm from inside. And the atmospheric carbon dioxide is also very high. So carbon dioxide is also very high. So hence it is warming from upper side as well as lower side. So we find the warming sensation is there from downward also and from upper side also. So because of that, this chunk of ice get separates from the ice shelf, and we refer this as ice calving. So this is referred as ice calving. Ice calving. Chunk of ice, when it separates, we refer that as ice calving. And this separated ice is referred as iceberg. Iceberg. Now, if there is a continuous ice calving is there, then what happens when there is a continuous ice calving? So in the context of ice calving, we will be losing traditional ice, the long deposited ice. So we will be losing traditional ice, losing the traditional ice, or the old ice is lost. Old ice is lost. And second one is that when the ice calving takes place, its surface area increases, and as the surface area increases, then the melting will be faster. So surface area of ice increases. Surface area of ice increases, and that will accelerate melting. Melting will accelerate. Is that clear? And this will add the sea level water. This will increase the sea level. So this is called as ice calving phenomenon, where we lose the old ice and the surface area increases, which adds more amount of water, right? Then other issues. Generally, when we talk about other issues, so here we talk about issues like agriculture. If you take the global losses every year, annually means every year, annually, there is a global loss of $220 billion from agriculture due to disease, because of the disease. Every year we find $220 billion of losses are there due to disease, which are seen in the plants like coffee, fruits, vegetables, etc. Many type of disease which affects that. Apart from that, due to increasing of the temperature, what happens when the temperature increases? The defense mechanism of plants decreases. The defense mechanism of plant, which can resist to the disease. Defense mechanism plant to resist the disease decreases. And that's why large amount of disease will be affected. So the disease will eat up entire crops. So defense mechanism is affected. So every year we find large disease are there. It can be horticulture, it can be vegetables, or it can be any type of the foods. Then due to increasing of the temperature, we find it has led to migration. So many disease you can find. So this is what we refer them. And sometimes when the temperature is increasing, it creates problem to the horticulture plants, like it will create sunburn to the fruits, right? Their quality will be deteriorated, and sometimes it will create cracks in the fruits, like pomegranate, where it develops the cracks. So these all are impact of the climate change. Apart from that, migration is also seen. So due to the impact of climate change, which reduces the rainfall patterns, which reduces many events like droughts are there. Some areas are having floods. Some areas, large amount of issues are there. So this makes the people to leave their area and move on to other areas. So migration of people is seen, where they move from one country to another country in the search of food and in the search of their protection. And apart from that, we find due to temperature, migration of species is also seen. Migration of species is also seen. Species means birds and marine organisms. Birds and marine organisms whose migration has increased. So hence it will affect the biodiversity. Migration of the species will affect biodiversity. Affect biodiversity. This is how you have to write your elaboration points. Apart from that, we also come across many types of pests which are attacking the agricultural crops. Pests, apart from disease, pests are also attacking. Like we have fall armyworm, FAW, which destroys 80 types of different crops like sugarcane, cabbage, etc. Which can destroy many type of standing crops. Apart from fall armyworm, we also have a classical evidences of the bulk of migratory pests called as locusts. We have evidence of this locust attack. This locust is destructive migratory pest. This locust is most destructive migratory pest. And this changes its direction due to the climate change. It changes its direction due to the impact of climate change. And hence, lakhs of these locusts enters and they'll destroy the crops. And we have seen them in India in the year 2020, where we refer them as the same. Yes, climate refugees is the name given to them. We refer them as climate refugees. Climate refugees. And this you have read many times, but it is the term which is not appropriate to be referred because COP28 talks about something, but it has not given clarity on climate refugees. They say they are climate refugees, but we don't have proper definition to be defined there. So generally we refer them as climate refugees. Right. So this is locust attack, and this which is seen in the context of the agricultural crops. Is that clear? So when you are reading, keep these things in the mind. So these all are the impact of the climate change and global warming, right? COP28 is only one. This is UNFCCC. We don't have any COPs which have reached to 28 number. Okay. Now, chronology. Focus on understanding this. Right. Now, in the context of 1960s, so I'm taking you the chronology from 1940s. What all happened from 1960s until today? Important events. We'll try to understand the chronology from 1960 to today. Important events which are associated with the global warming and climate change. So what happens in the 1960s? So 1960s, where the people started talking about climate change. So response was started to growing in the people regarding climate change. So response started to grow among the people with reference to the climate issues, with reference to the climate issues, or we say environmental issues, or environmental issues in the year 1960s, 62, 63, etc. Now, this created awareness among the people. This created awareness among the people. And then nations began to take actions within their boundaries. They started talking about the environmental issues within their boundaries. Ultimately, in the year 1972, it led to creation of the first global conference. In the year 1972. We refer that as Stockholm Conference. In the year 1972. We refer that as Stockholm Conference. And the Stockholm Conference is also referred as United Nations Conference on Human Environment. So this response is responsible for the Stockholm Conference of June 5 and 16. Right. So this international consensus or cooperation led to United Nations Conference on Environment. It is also referred as Stockholm Conference. Right. So this is the first major international conference on environment. This United Nations Conference on Human Environment, or Stockholm Conference, is the first major international event. It created two important references. It made two important points. So what are the two important points? The first one is it made the environmental issues. It put the environmental issues into international agenda. It made the environmental issues or climate issues to international agenda. Right. So it provided international base to climate issues. It provided international platform to the environmental issues. And the second point is it established the relationship between environment and economic development. A very significant point. It created the relationship between economic development and environment. So it means that it says that environmental development and economic development both are the two faces of same coin. I'm repeating, environmental concern and economic development are the two faces of the same coin. If you want to make any policy, both are taken into consideration. Economic development and environment both are important. Environment and economic development both are important. Economic development which destroys environment is not beneficial. And environment without the economic development is not providing any growth. So the growth should link environmental concern as well as economic development. So hence it says that the economic development and environment are the two faces of the same coin, and both should be taken into priority. Both are important. You can't neglect economic development keeping environment concern, and you can't neglect economic development keeping environment as concern. In the same way, you can't reduce the environmental impact due to economic growth. You can't neglect environment keeping economic growth. So both are balanced, both are important. So economic development is also important. Environmental concern is also very important. So this is something which is referred as the United Nations Conference on Environment. And the outcome of this, it was responsible for setting of United Nations Environment Program. United Nation Program. Right. So it created something, United Nations Environment Program. United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, in the year 1972 at the headquarters Nairobi in Africa, in South Africa, in Nairobi. Headquarter is at Nairobi. Nairobi. Now, what is the role of United Nations Environment Program? It is to guide and coordinate environmental activities within the United Nations or within the United Nations. Now, this United Nations Environment Program, it plays many important role in the formation of many committees. So it forms many committees. It provides assistance. It provides assistance. It manages many funds. Manages many funds. Right. So many types of activities are there. Committees, assistance, and all. So it takes care of the events which are associated with disasters and conflicts, climate change, ecosystem management. All these are taken into consideration. So for all these areas, the United Nations Environment Program was set up in the year 1972 in South Africa, that is Kenya, with headquarters at Nairobi. Many recommendations will be there. Many reports will be there, which are released by that. Reports which will be released by that. And these reports are very, very important. So when you are reading the reports, please read the reports which are released by United Nations Environment Program. They're very important for your prelims as well as the mains. Prelims as well as the mains. Is that clear? Right. Now, as they found that this has created something important in the year 1972, and the date is June 5. And hence we decided that why don't we create awareness, keeping that June 5 as a day. And hence this June 5 become a benchmark to celebrate World Environment Day. So every year we celebrate World Environment Day on June 5. June 5th is celebrated as World Environment Day. Every year. And the first World Environment Day was celebrated in the year 2023. In Sweden, it was hosted by Sweden, that is Stockholm, in the year 2023. And the theme of that, it was celebrated in the year 1973. 1973. And the theme of the first World Environment Day was Only One Earth. Only One Earth. And we celebrated the 50th anniversary in the year 2023. We celebrated 50th on 2023. See, I told it established the relationship. I told it establishes relationship between environment and economic development. Both are two important points. Right. So 2023, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of World Environment Day. Right. So every year it was celebrated from 1973. Every year we celebrate the World Environment Day to create awareness. Among the people about that. Right. Now, it continued from 1973 and till 1987. In the year 1987, there was something which was changed. The venues started to rotated from 1987. This you should keep in the mind. So from 1987, the venues, they started to be rotated. So hence, from 1987, we had a concept of host country. Host, which hosts the World Environment Day. And the host country for 2023. The host country for 2023, which hosted the World Environment Day, is a country which is referred as Cote d'Ivoire. The host country was Cote d'Ivoire, or it is called as Ivory Coast. In partnership with Netherlands. In partnership with Netherlands. Partner was Netherlands. Fact. And the theme for 2023. It emphasizes on plastic pollution, solution to plastic pollution. Solution to plastic pollution. Is that clear? Solution to the plastic pollution. Is that clear? So please remember this. Solution to the plastic pollution, right? Now, this year, 2024, again, June 5, you will be celebrating. June 5 will be celebrating. Now, which country is the host of 2024? Which country will be hosting the 2024? Right. It is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the host. And what is the theme of this? What is the theme of 2024? Theme means what should be highlighted. What should be highlighted? That should be kept in the mind. Theme means it focuses. It focuses. So it focuses on very important point, that is land restoration. Not only it talks about land restoration, it also talks about desertification. And drought resilience. Drought resilience. So this is the theme of 2024. This is the theme of 2024. Drought resilience. Is that clear? Now, when we talk about the drought resilience, you should remember the drought resilience. The term resilience is associated with two meanings. Resilience means resistance. Resilience means resistance. And also recover quickly. Quick recovery. Quick recovery. So resilience means drought resistance and quick recovery from the impact of the drought. Quick recovery from the impact of the drought. So this is all about the World Environment Day. Is it clear? 2024. So 2023 we celebrated 50th year of the World Environment Day celebrations, right? So this is something about 1970s, and we reached to a point where they made a strong reference that there is a systematic relationship between economic development as well as environment. Now this has to be studied more. That has to be studied more. The relationship has to be studied more. So hence the Brand Commission was set up in 1980. The Brand Commission. And this Brand Commission is an independent commission on the international development. And this was headed by Willy Brandt, the former German chancellor. And the major idea was to study the economic development as well as environmental concern. To study the economic development and environmental concern of the world. It studied that in detail, that how the economic activities are there, what type of activities and what type of environmental concerns are there. Now, in this Brand Commission, After studying that economic perspectives of entire Earth, this created a concept called as brand line, imaginary line. It created a brand line, which is referred as a line which demarcates the north and south. It is also referred as north and south divide. North and south divide. So it said that all the countries which are in the northern part, they are referred as developed countries. And the countries which are in the south of that brand line, they are developing countries. Developing countries. So this brand line was very significant in 1980s. In 1980s, this brand line was very important. Yes, we refer that as global south and global north. The same thing, global south and global north. So global south are developing countries, or we say underdeveloping countries. Developing, or sometimes we say underdeveloping countries. So developed and developing countries. Very vague concept was there. Apart from that, it also says that already the entire earth is having environmental issues. Both countries, both group of countries should work together, or else the problem will not be settled. So hence it highlighted that both developed as well as developing countries should work together. Both should work together. Both should work together. Or else it cannot be, settled here. Is it clear? So hence you should remember these things, global south and global north. Now they had brand commission and brand report in the hand. Brand commission, it says that the earth is completely biased. Part of the earth is very well developed, part of the earth is less developed or developing. And they have their own type of environmental concern and economic issues were there. And this has to be studied a bit more. This has to be studied a bit more. So hence it reached to United Nations. It reached to United Nations. And then United Nations General Assembly. United Nations General Assembly. We refer that as UNGA, United Nations General Assembly. It set up a commission to study the brand report and also the present condition of the north and south. And this commission is very, very important. We refer that as Brundtland Commission. So United Nations General Assembly set up a commission called as Brundtland Commission or World Commission on Environmental Development. Both are same. Very important commission. Brundtland Commission. Right. And here it is to link the findings of brand report, that is global south and global north, and also to discuss the international and national strategies for protecting the environment, protecting the climate change issues, because they already highlighted that yes, the environmental issues are not the same. Developed countries have different problems, developing countries have different problems. So hence it was to discuss the environmental concern. And this Brundtland Commission, which was set up in the year 1983, it submitted its report in the year 1987. Submitted its report in the year 1987. And we refer that as Brundtland Report. We refer that as Brundtland Report. And this Brundtland Report has a title called as Our Common Future. It has a title called as Our Common Future. Very significant, very important one. And in this report called as Our Common Futures, for the first time, it used the term called as sustainable development. For the first time, it has used the word called as sustainable development. Sustainable development. For the first time, it has used this term sustainable development. So the sustainable development has origin from the Brundtland Report. From Brundtland Report. And it says that you need to have the strategies. And the strategies are such that you have to integrate You have to integrate economic development with environment, or else the world will face major problem. So hence it says that it highlighted what the Stockholm Conference has said. You have to integrate environment with economic development. Environment and economic development, both are important. Only environment is not important without economic development, and economic development without the environmental concern is not important. Both are important. So hence it says that environment and economic development, both are important. Both are important. You can't drop any project, you can't drop any economic activity by just saying the environmental concerns are there, or you can't take up all the economic activity, all the project, destroying the environmental concerns. So hence there should be a balance between economic development and environmental concerns. So hence there should be a balance. There should be a balance between economic development and environmental concern. Economic development and environmental concern. Without that, it is not possible. So hence, the sustainable development become a word which started to be established its strong foothold in the discussion. Now, what is sustainable development? What is sustainable development? Sustainable development means that we should also reap the benefit, and the next generation should also reap the benefit without degradation. We should also reap the benefit, and the next generation should also reap the benefit without the degradation. We refer that as sustainable development. Now, the classical example of this is if you take agriculture. In the agriculture, if you are using chemical fertilizers, so using of chemical fertilizer is a development. Using of chemical fertilizer is a development. Right. So the development which can benefit to the farmer maybe for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. After that, the soil will not be fertile. So using of the chemical fertilizer can give development for a short period of a time. For a short period of a time. But in the later stage, the soil will lose fertility. The soil will lose its fertility. So many soils or many agricultural lands have become abandoned when we use the chemical fertilizer. It is an example of development. It is an example of development. Now, in the context of agriculture, instead of chemical fertilizers, if you use organic farming, so you will also reap the benefit. The present generation will also get the benefit. And the next generation, after 50 years, after 100 years also, they will reap the benefit. Next generation will also reap benefit. Next generation will also reap benefit. Reap benefit without degradation. Without degradation. And we refer this as sustainable development. We refer this as sustainable development. So in the context of India, we need development which is sustained, not the development which is a short term. We need a sustainable development. We need a sustainable development. And this sustainable development has three major components. This sustainable development has three major components. So when you are writing any answer on sustainable development, you should remember that this sustainable development is fulfilling all the three criteria. It is fulfilling all the three criteria. So what are the three criteria where it has to satisfy? The three criteria where it has to satisfy. The first one is environmental protection, whether it is balancing the environmental protection. Second, whether it is providing economic growth. So both two phases are there. Economic growth is also important. Environmental concern is also important. And the third one is referred as social equity. It means that whether this is addressing the issues, whether it is addressing the issues like poverty, knowledge, education, etc. it should reduce these aspects also. It should reduce the impact of poverty. It should provide education. It should increase the standard of living in all the people of the world. So hence, it should address the disparities. It should address the disparities and barrier. It should address the disparities and barriers. Then only we refer that as social equity. It should reduce the disparities, like gender issues, it has to settle. Knowledge base, it has to increase. Health standards, it has to issues. Poverty, it has to decrease. Per capita income, it has to increase. So all that issues has to be settled. We refer that as social equity. So henceforth, when you're writing any answer on sustainable development, you have to see that this sustainable development is fulfilling three conditions. The first one is whether it is creating economic impact, whether it is creating employment opportunities, whether it is creating revenues or not. Second, while creating the revenues, is it maintaining environment? Is it maintaining environment concern or not? It means whether it is keeping the resources stronger or not. The third one is whether it is making impact on social capital, that is social equity. Social equity. And if it is satisfied all the three conditions, then only we refer that as sustainable development, or else we don't call them as the sustainable development. Right? So please remember these things. Sustainable development. See, Brundtland report highlighted that the issues of the developing countries and the developed countries are different. And it said that for the first time, the entire earth, the countries are segregated into two ways. That is, the northern part of the brand line is called as developed countries, and the southern part of the brand line is referred as developing countries. And they have different type of problems. And hence it highlighted that as they're having different problems, as they're having different types of problems, they have to combinedly work together to settle the issues of environmental concern or settle the climate change issues. So that is what the brand line or Bland report says. So it highlighted that there is economic disparities existed in the earth or on the earth, and these economic disparities are also affecting the development and environmental concerns. So this is something which is referred as sustainable development. So when you're writing sustainable development, please keep these three concepts. If any development fulfills all these three criteria, then only we refer that as sustainable development, or else it is not called as sustainable development, right? Then IPCC was created in the year 1988. Factual data. Fact. And here it was created by United Nations Environment Program and World Meteorological Organization. So remember this, UNEP, which was set up in the year 1972, and World Meteorological Organization. So it was created by these. Now, what is the role of IPCC? It provided science-based inputs for the climate change issues. It provides science-based inputs. Science-based inputs to the climate change issue. Climate change issues. And it releases its reports regularly. We refer them as assessment reports. Assessment reports. And already it has released 6 reports. And these reports are very important, which gives a complete idea about the present trend of climate change and the recommendations or whatever suggestions it has given. The assessments and reports, they are very important in tackling the climate change. And these inputs, the inputs which are given by the IPCC, are discussed in the conference of parties or discussed when they meet. They are discussed in COPs. Discussed in COPs when they meet. So this was in the year 1988. Now, with reference to United Nations, they had a complete data. So they had Brundtland report, they had IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this IPCC has given many data, science-based data. And it also highlighted that, yes, the Earth is undergoing issues associated with the climate change. And that's why United Nations decided that in the year 1989, it decided that why don't we take a global conference? Why don't we make a global conference where the different countries of the world will meet and discuss their strategies. World conference to discuss the strategies which they are facing, both developed as well as developing countries. Developed and developing countries. Both should come together. They should share their experience. They should explain what type of issues they are facing, what type of the suggestions they are providing. So hence negotiations, discussions was required. I'm repeating, negotiations and the discussions was required from both developed as well as developing countries in the present scenarios. That's what the United Nations felt. So hence it gave a call, for global conference for developed as well as developing countries. And this call was responded very effectively. And hence, in the year 1992, the systematic conference was held. In the year 1992, the call of United Nations was responded very effectively by all the countries of the world. And hence, they met in the year 1992 in the place called as Rio de Janeiro. And this meeting, where the comprehensive discussion was done in the year 1992, is referred as the Earth Summit, or it is also referred as Rio Summit, or it is also referred as United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. All the three terms are same. As it was held in Rio de Janeiro, it is also called as Rio Conference. So very important and significant one in the year 1992. And this is with response to the United Nations call for all the developed as well as developing countries. Both group of countries were there, developed as well as developing countries, to discuss the strategies, to share their experiences, right? And this was with a theme called as environment and sustainable development. So that was the theme of this conference, environment and sustainable development, right? So Earth Summit or Rio Summit of 1992 is with response to the call by United Nations to discuss the strategies, share their experiences in the context of environmental issues and in the context of sustainable development. So hence, the outcome of this is very important. So here it created 2 declaration and 3 conventions. 2 declarations and 3 conventions. Among the 2 declarations, the first declaration is referred as Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. So it talks about the strategies which the globe or the earth has to make in the context of environmental concern and economic development. So there won't be much question on Rio Declaration. So Rio Declaration is something, a strategy to establish the balance between environment and economic development. Strategy to maintain a balance between the environment and economic development. But the important one is Agenda 21. So what is this Agenda 21 and what the terms talk about? This 21 talks about 21st century. 21 is 21st century. Right. Now what is the agenda? Agenda is blueprint of sustainable development for the 21st century. Agenda is the blueprint blueprint of sustainable development. Sustainable development for 21st century. Right. Now, the moment when you talk about sustainable development, you should remember sustainable development talks about three concepts. What are the three concepts? Environmental concern, economic development, and social equity. That is reducing poverty, creating literacy, reducing disparities, providing knowledge base, providing standard of living, right? So increasing awareness among the people. So all these are referred as the social equities. All are referred as social equities. So hence, agenda for 21st century is referred as Agenda 21, which is an outcome of Earth Summit. Is it clear? Okay. Now, the three important conventions. The three important conventions. They are United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Convention on Biological Diversity, and United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. So three important conventions were there. Now, the first one is referred as United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is non-legally binding, not legally binding, not legally binding. And the countries which have signed that, they're referred as Conference of Parties to UNFCCC. Conference of Parties to UNFCCC. And they meet every year. Like COP1, COP2, etc. Right. So in the year 2023, they had COP28. In the year 2023, every year they meet up. So that is the first convention, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second one is CBD, that is Convention on Biological Diversity. And this is legally binding. Legally binding. And the countries which have signed that, signatories, they are referred as COP to CBD. COP of UNFCCC is different. COP to CBD is different. All are different group of countries. They may be overlapping, but different countries. Overlapping may be there. India has signed UNFCCC, India has signed CBD. Overlapping is there. But the group of UNFCCC are different from the COP of CBD. And these, they meet once in 2 years. Is that clear? And the third one is UNCCD. See, CBD full form is Convention on Biological Diversity. It is CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. Then UNCCD, United Nations Convention for Combating Desertification. So this UNCCD, right? It is also legally binding. Legally binding. And so when we talk about the legally binding, so it meets once in 2 years. The countries which have signed that, they have their own COPs. I don't know where is CBC. I never talked about any CBC. Where is CBC? Please reframe your statement. Please put the data where the CBC is. Okay, apologies. CBD. CBD. COP to CBD. Right. So apologies. Vikram and Kush and all, apologies. It is instead of CBC, it is CBD. Is it clear? So Convention on Biological Diversity, COP to CBD. Is it clear now? Apologies. It's not CBC, it is CBD. Right. Now, the countries which have signed United Nations Convention for the combating desertification, they meet once in 2 years. They meet once in 2 years. So please keep this framework in the mind. UNFCCC, CBD, and UNCCD. Three important conventions and two declarations, Rio Declaration and Agenda 21. Every year a question is asked on that. Every year, either in the mains or in the prelims, the question is asked about sustainable development. So please keep that. Sustainable development, very important benchmark word, right? Now, next is something called as the term COP, Conference of Parties. Just read that. It is a group of nations which have signed the convention, and it is their governing body, right? They meet periodically, either every year, once in 2 years, once in 3 years, to discuss the strategies, to discuss their strategies and global progress, or to review the progress which has been done here. Is it clear? So always, whenever when you are reading, you should remember COP, then convention, which convention and which COP are there, and their numbers, whether they are meeting for the first time or whether they are meeting for the 12th time, 14th time, or 28th time. Is that clear? So COP is Conference of Parties, governing bodies. Is it clear? So the meeting we refer them as COP1, COP2, etc. Now, here we talk about a type of a fund. In the context of ozone depletion, I told unilateral or microlateral funds are there. Multilateral funds are there. In the context of ozone, I told multilateral fund. Multilateral fund in the ozone depletion. In the same way, the Global Environment Facility was also created. Very important fund in the year 1992. This was created in the year 1992 in the eve of Earth Summit. Now, what is the significance of that? This Global Environment Facility, it is a fund which provide finances, to the five conventions. They are the three conventions of Earth Summit, that is UNFCCC, CBD, and UNCCD, plus two conventions on pollution. And these are Minamata Convention and Stockholm Convention on POP. So these two are associated with pollution, and three are from Earth Summit. So it provides the financial assistance. So every time this Global Environment Facility is in current affairs. So please remember, its base is in 1992. So it was created in the year 1992, and even today it provides financial assistance to five conventions. Three are from Earth Summit and two are from pollution. One is Minamata Convention and the second one is Stockholm Convention for persistent organic pollutant. Is it clear? So 1992 means it operated. It was formed, and from 1992 it started or entered into force. Is that clear? So please remember this. Entered into force. And this is managed by United Nations Development Program, World Bank, and UNEP. So these facts they can ask in the prelims. And this Global Environment Facility provide financial assistance to the developing countries. And the countries with economies in the transition. It means centralized economies to meet the environmental concern. So in general, we say the Global Environment Facility provides financial assistance to the developing countries for five conventions. Right. Now, the first convention is United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Now, the moment when you talk about desertification issue, you should remember that this desertification is one of the major concern in the present scenarios. So what does desertification means? Desertification means that it is the land which has degraded. Now, what is the land degradation? Land degradation means where the land is unable to perform its activities. A degraded land Degraded land is the land which is unable to perform its services, where the land is unable to perform its services or benefits. We refer that as land degradation. We refer that as land degradation. So please remember this. It is unable to perform its services. Services in the sense food, carbon capture, releasing of oxygen, absorbing of carbon dioxide, growing of the trees, etc. We refer them as services or the benefits. So any land which is unable to provide the benefits like food production, planting the trees, or carbon sink, etc. So such types of lands where they are not performing the benefits to the humanity, we refer them as land degradation. And this land degradation has become a major problem in the present scenarios. Major problem in the scenarios, maybe due to deforestation or maybe due to soil erosion. So many reasons are there. Many reasons are there for land degradation. That is soil erosion, then deforestation, cutting up of trees, deforestation, then we also have something called as unscientific grazing or overgrazing in the areas, overgrazing, or construction activities, etc. So all these they reduce the land's capacity to provide the benefits, which in the longer term can create the issues like food security or other parts. Yes, you can add drought also. Which is due to climate change. You can add that also, right? So droughts, all these, they reduce the capacity of the land to provide food, provide the services. So hence the lands are becoming degraded in the present concept. So hence an international convention was required. So we did not have any type of international convention. So hence in the year 1992, when the Earth Summit was there, so there the first international convention was signed, sole legally binding. So it means the first one or the only. So it is the sole or the only legally binding international agreement which links environment development to the sustainable land management. And apart from that, its best thing is bottom up approach. It means that it is very much decentralized. Local people has a more say in that. So local people participation was very significant. Local people, they decided their action. Local people, they decided the action. They play important role in framing the policy. So it was bottom up approach. And it is the only international agreement which links the land degradation with the environmental concern. Now if we take the land degradation, it was continuously seen in the all part of the world. If you see the Indian perspective, in the context of India also, we find 30% of land in India is degraded. 30% of land in India is degraded, where the productivity is very, very low, which can become a major problem in the present scenario. So hence, we needed an international convention, and that's where UNCCD was formed, right? And they meet once in 2 years. And the last meeting was COP15, which was in the year 2022, and this was held in Abidjan of Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. right? Now, before this, you have to remember one small point. COP 14. COP 14 was held in India. COP 14 of UNCCD. UNCCD was held in India, right? In the year 2020. Now, what was the outcome of COP 14, which was held in India? So it created a strong statement called as Delhi Declaration. Delhi Declaration, which is accepted by all the countries. So what does this Delhi Declaration says? Delhi Declaration means land degradation neutrality by 2030. It talks about land degradation neutrality by 2030. Now, all the member countries accepted this as a strong point and they put them into their policies. Land degradation neutrality by 2030. So what does this land degradation neutrality means? Land degradation neutrality means to make sure that the state of the land, the quality of the land, or the content of the land becomes normal and starts providing the benefits. To make sure the quality of the land or the state of a land which has degraded starts providing the services, which has degraded will starts providing the services, will starts providing the provide benefits, so that the land degradation which has been destroyed is providing into action. Now, can you give any example? Can you give any methodology how the land degradation neutrality can be reached? Any methodology, any one example, how do the land degradation neutrality can be achieved? How to achieve this land degradation neutrality? Perfect. It can be afforestation, organic farming, then multiple cropping. Perfect. Multiple cropping. Then can you talk something on irrigation pattern? Right. Mulching activities, irrigation pattern means we have to talk about drip irrigation, farm mechanization, right? So farm mechanization, all these are there. So UPSC will 100% ask question on land degradation neutrality and what are the ways in which the land degradation neutrality has to be reached here. So many methods are there: rainwater harvesting, water conservation, like the wetlands, rainwater conservation, wetlands to store the groundwater, drip irrigations, reducing soil erosion. Then we have something called as, have you heard about soil health cards? Nutrient based agricultural activities, so that the yields are also beneficial. Is it clear? So all these you should keep in the mind. So many factors are there which talks about the land degradation neutrality. So when you're writing that, keep that flow chart in the mind. So what is land degradation neutrality? The moment when you say, you should remember this definition. Where it is unable to provide, you don't have to write scientific definition. No scientific definition is required here. You have to just mention that what is land degradation and what are the reason for the land degradation, then how you can restore that and what are the policies are there. One is UNCCD 14, which talks about land degradation neutrality, and then the outcomes of COP 15 UNCCD. Now this you should keep in the mind. Along with this you should add the recent update of 2022. So what the 2022 update says? The 2022 update says that they made the global pledge to boost drought resilience. Now the moment when we say resilience, so what do you mean by resilience? You should always keep the moment when the resilience is there, you should keep the two words in the mind, that is resistance and quick recovery. recovery. So these two words you should keep in the mind. So whenever droughts are there, drought resistant crops you should grow. Drought resistant crops you should grow, or you should make all the arrangements so that you can resist the droughts. If you are unable to resist that, then recover quickly, come back very fast. So that is called as resilience. If you are unable to, then you have to go with resilience. So generally we talk about many technologies are there, like genetically modified crops. Yes, but they are not completely suitable, but sometimes we say they are very mandatory, right? So land restoration in the future prosperity. Then it also talks about intergovernmental working group on drought, which has to be studying and making all the type of arrangements here, right? So it will take the policies and instrument at the regional and national level, so that it will help the countries to make sure that they are in line with all the type of land degradation neutrality policies, right? So it also talks about the global consensus on boosting the drought resilience and identifying the expansion of dry lands and improving the national policies and early warning. Now, why early warning? When you talk about the droughts, so droughts are considered as a disaster. Droughts are considered as disasters, and hence in the context of disasters, one of the important aspect of disaster management is pre-disaster management. One of the important is pre-disaster management, and in the pre-disaster management, early warning plays an important role. Early warning plays an important role. And hence, as this drought is extreme weather based issue, so hence you should have an early warning system which can make the people to prepare in the context of droughts. As the droughts have increased in the intensities and frequencies, they need early warning. To prepare themselves in the context of drought like conditions, right? Then it also talks about environmental sustainability. So please remember, sustainability means, again, the terms economic, environment, and social equity, right? And it also talks about achieving gender equality. It means involving women in all type of economic activity, not neglecting the women. You should not neglect the women here. So women should be taken as the part and parcel of that. And its theme is land, life, and legacy. Land, life, and legacy. That is, improve the lands, so that it is improving the lifestyles. Improve the lands to improve the lifestyles. Improve the lifestyles. Is it clear? So this is some rough idea about the COP with reference to UNCCD, United Nations Convention for Combating Desertification. Is that clear? Now we move on to UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now the moment when you talk about UNFCCC, it is very important intergovernmental treaty developed to address the problems of climate change. Then it entered into force on 21st March 1994. Right? It is a fundamental agreement that has provided platform for discussing the international perspectives. Now, the first conference was held in the year 1995, that was in the Berlin. Then 8th was in India. Then 21st was in Paris. Then 28th was in Dubai. Every year it is held. Yearly it is held. Right. Now, where do you find the COP29th will be held? In the year 2024. Which country will be hosting COP29? Which country will be hosting the COP29? See, in the context of Indian drought scenario, we'll discuss that when I take the what we refer them as National Action Plan on Climate Change. So there I'll discuss India's drought scenarios. First, understand the international aspect, then Indian perspective we will take care. Right. So try to find out this, where the COP29, which will be held in this year. right? Now we'll take up certain important conventions of this, sorry, important conference of that, and that is Kyoto, and then we moved on to the Paris Agreement. Kyoto, Paris Agreement, and latest updates in that, right? Now the first one is the Kyoto in the year 1993. Another 10 minutes, at least we will have a discussion, then we can have a break, right? Azerbaijan, perfect one. Now this was the third conference of parties, and the outcomes which took place in Kyoto, the outcomes of the Kyoto, we refer that as Kyoto Protocol. The outcomes of Kyoto. Kyoto is in Japan. It is in Japan. And all the decisions which were taken in the Kyoto, we refer that as Kyoto Protocols. Kyoto Protocol. Right. And here you should remember, UNFCCC is not legally binding, but Kyoto Protocol is legally binding. Kyoto Protocol is legally binding. Legally binding. Now, what this Kyoto Protocol and what decisions are there? Now, it is very important to know that this Kyoto Protocol or the outcomes of the Kyotos, so where it has highlighted, it is the first international serious effort. It is the first international serious effort to find a solution for climate change. To find a solution for climate change. Climate change. How? What is the way in which it can go? It is a first serious international effort to find a solution for climate change by or through reducing of greenhouse gas emission. Climate change through reducing of greenhouse gas emission. It is a first international effort to find a solution for the climate change through reducing of greenhouse gas emission. That is reducing of greenhouse gas emission. So we say it is a first strategy. First strategy for the context of climate change. And it also highlighted that the developed countries are the major contributors of climate change. Developed countries are the major contributors of climate change. Developed countries are major contributors of climate change. How? By their historic emission and per capita emission. Per capita emission. Developed countries are the major contributors of climate change because of their historic emission and per capita emission. And they have the greatest possibilities. And these developed countries, they have the greatest capacities to reduce greenhouse gases. To reduce greenhouse gas emission. So these two statements you should keep in the mind. Developed countries are the major contributors of climate change, and they should reduce their greenhouse gas emission to provide a solution for climate change. And developed countries are the major contributors. So first time it highlighted that the developed countries are major contributors. And because of these parameters, this created a principle. And that principle is referred as CBDR. It says, even though the developed countries are responsible, but developed countries are responsible for climate change, developing countries should also contribute. Developing countries should also contribute. So hence it created CBDR, that is common but differentiated responsibilities. Common but differentiated responsibilities. Differentiated responsibilities with respective capabilities. With respective capabilities. Right. CBDR, please keep this in the mind. Every time in the current affairs, they talk CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities with respective capabilities. Now, what are common objectives and what are differentiative responsibilities? So, what are common responsibilities? Common responsibilities. Common responsibilities means common responsibilities of both developed countries, developed and developing countries. Both developed as well as developing countries, they should fight for the impact of climate change. Both should fight for climate change issues. Both should fight for climate change issues. Both developed as well as developing countries, both should fight. Now, what are differentiated responsibilities? What are differentiated responsibilities? Differentiated responsibilities. The differentiated responsibilities are, the first one is the developed countries should take binding of emission of greenhouse gas. The developed countries should take binding of emission of greenhouse gas. Should take binding of emission of greenhouse gas, GHG. And the second one is developed countries should provide technical and financial assistance to the developing countries. The developed countries, they should provide technical and financial assistance to the developing countries. Should provide technical and financial assistance. Financial assistance to the developing countries. To the developing countries. Right. So they should provide technical and financial assistance to the developing countries. So these are referred as differentiated responsibilities. And what are common responsibilities? Common responsibilities means that both developed as well as developing countries should contribute in the context of climate change. So this is the basic philosophy of the Kyoto, which was in the year 1997. We refer that as Kyoto Protocol. And these outcomes are referred as Kyoto Protocol, which are binding. And to implement this Kyoto Protocol, to implement all these, the developed countries to take binding of emission of greenhouse gas, and also to provide technical and financial assistance. It has divided the entire countries of the earth into three groups. To implement that, it has divided all the countries into three groups. All the countries of the world into three groups, right? To implement this Kyoto Protocol. Now, what are these three groups? Very technical in the nature. Three groups, that is Annex 1, Annex 2, and non-Annex 1 countries. It is to implement Kyoto Protocol. Annex 1 countries. So what are Annex 1 countries? So Annex 1 countries are the developed countries, industrialized countries, and which are members of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Annex 1, developed countries, and which are also the members of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. plus whose economies are not in transition, whose economies are not in transition. It means that their economies are open economies. So they are open for all. So they're not centralized economies. So the economies, the countries whose economies are centralized, we refer them as economies in transition. Economies in transition. So here, apologies for that. Right. So economies in transition. It means that there are two types of countries are there in the world. One is those countries whose economies are centralized. Those countries whose economies are centralized. And those countries whose economies are moving towards open market. Those countries whose economies are moving towards open market. Moving toward open market. Moving towards open market. So centralized economy and economies in transition. So the countries which are moving towards open market, we refer them as economies in transition. Economies in transition. And those countries which are centralized, where they are not making any type of liberalization, where they are still having centralized, we refer them as economies not in transition. Economies not in transition. So economies in transition means those countries which have moved from centralized to the open market. Centralized to the open market. So hence here, developed countries, members of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and those countries whose economies are in transition. EIT, economies in transition. It means they have moved from centralized to the open. Moved from centralized to the open. So these countries, they have to take binding of emission of greenhouse gas. So these countries, they have to take binding of emission of greenhouse gas. Now the second group of countries is annexed to countries. So what are annexed to countries? So annexed to countries are also developed countries, plus they are also the members of OECD, that is Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They are also the members of OECD, plus their economies are not in transition. Their economies are not in transition. Not in transition. So these countries, they have to provide technical and financial assistance. They don't have to take any binding. These countries do not have to take any binding, but they have to provide technical. They have to provide technical and financial assistance. Financial assistance. They have to provide this to the developing countries. So remember, Annex 1 countries have to take binding, and Annex 2 countries, no binding of emission of greenhouse gases. Annex 2 countries has to provide technical and financial assistance. Technical and financial assistance. And last one is non-Annex 1 countries. Non-Annex 1 countries are the developing countries. Developing countries like India, Brazil, etc. So these non-Annex 1 countries, they do not have any binding, no binding. No binding of emission. No binding of emission, but they get the financial assistance in the context of climate change. They are eligible for financial assistance. They get financial assistance for their climate change work. They get financial assistance for their climate change work. So we refer them as three categories: Annex 1, Annex 2, and non-Annex 1. Don't get much confused. Annex 1 countries are the countries which are developed countries who are the members of OECD and whose economies in transition. They have to take binding of emission of greenhouse gas. Annex 2 countries. Annex 2 countries are also the developed countries, which are also the members of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and their economies are not in transition. They are still centralized economy. And these countries, they have to provide technical and financial assistance to the developing countries. And non-Annex 1 countries are those countries which are developing and poor countries. Developing and poor countries. And these are the countries, they do not have any type of binding, and they are the countries which get the financial assistance for their contribution to the climate change work. They have to contribute to the climate change. That is common responsibilities. Common responsibilities. They have to be contributing. They have to do something. Then only they will get financial assistance, or else they can't get. So they get incentives in the climate change work. So developing countries will get incentives, financial assistance when they perform the work here. So we refer them as the non-Annex 1 countries. Yes, we'll discuss that. What is limit and bindings are there. First, understand Annex 1, Annex 2, and Annex 2. Now, here the problem was there are many Annex 1 countries. There are many Annex 1 countries. Which countries have to take binding? And there are many greenhouse gases. How many greenhouse gas binding has to be done? So the question was with these two. How many of the Annex 1 countries have to take the binding? And what greenhouse gases should be reduced? We have many greenhouse gases were there. What greenhouse gases should be reduced, and which countries of Annex 1 has to take the binding? Hundreds of Annex 1 countries are there, but not all. So hence it was decided that we have to make which group of countries in Annex 1 and which greenhouse gases has to be taken into reduction. And for that, they created two annexes, Annex A and Annex B. Now, Annex B is part of Annex 1 countries where they have to take the binding of emission of greenhouse gases. So Annex B is countries of Annex 1 who have to take the reduction of greenhouse gas emission, and they identified 37 countries plus European Union. 37 countries and European Union who have to take the binding of emission. Take binding of emission of greenhouse gas. So hence we say Annex B is a subgroup of Annex 1. So this is Annex 1. So in that, Annex B has to take the limitation. Annex B has to take the limitation. So Annex B defines the group of countries which have to reduce their greenhouse gas emission. Now, what are the greenhouse gases to be reduced? It talks about 6 greenhouse gases to be reduced. 6 greenhouse gases which has to be reduced. And we refer them as the 6 greenhouse gases of Kyoto Protocol. And these 6 greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbon, then fluorofluorocarbon, and sulfur oxide. Right. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbon, perfluorocarbon, and sulfur dioxide. Sulfur hexachloride. So these are referred as 6 greenhouse gases, which has to be reduced by Annex B countries. Reduced by Annex B countries. Now, what is the proportion of reduction? How much they have to reduce? What amount has to be reduced here? So this reduction was given into 2 bindings. It was given into what we refer them as the targets which were given. Now, the first target which was there, the first target was the 37 plus European countries or European Union. They have to reduce 5% of 1990 level of greenhouse gases. 5% of 1990 level of greenhouse gases in between 2008 up to 2012. So this is called as first commitment period. This is called as first commitment period, right? So 5% of 1990 level has to be reduced by 2080 and 2012. So within this 2008 and 2012, so they have to reduce 5% of 1990 level. So that was the first commitment period, and this first commitment period ended in the year 2013, where it was amended. It was amended in Doha, and hence it is referred as Doha Amendment. Hence it is referred as Doha Amendment, and that is called as the second amendment period, second commitment period. And this second commitment period was from 2013 to 2020. Now, what was the target? The target was to reduce 18% of 1990 level of greenhouse gases by 2030 and 2020. 2030 and 2020. So these are referred as the two commitment periods which has to be taken by the Annex B countries which are part of Annex 1. Now here the important tragedy is that this entered into phase, but the second commitment period has never entered into phase. It was never implemented. So only the first commitment period was implemented, and that too, it was only 20 to 30% of objectives were reached. So partially achieved. The first commitment was partially achieved. The second commitment period never entered into force. It never entered into force. Never entered into force. Please remember these two. Okay. So that's what I told. The first one is they reached very small, but the second was never entered into force. It never entered into force. They were only in the papers. So hence we decided that the Kyoto Protocol is not going to work out. The Kyoto Protocol is not going to work out. So hence this Kyoto Protocol is now replaced by Paris Agreement. So because there were many drawbacks in the Kyoto Protocol, this Kyoto Protocol is replaced by second strategy called as Paris Agreement, which we will be discussing later. Annex A countries, Annex B. Now here, please remember, Annex A, here it talks about greenhouse gases. Annex B talks about countries. And Annex B countries are the countries which have to take the binding of greenhouse gas emission. That is 5% of 1990 level in between 2008 to 2012. That was the first commitment period. And the second commitment period was 18% of 1990 level from 2013 to 2020. In that first commitment period was partially achieved. The second commitment period never entered into force. Second commitment period never entered into force. Is that clear? So please remember. So go through this systematically. It divided, Kyoto Protocol divided all the countries into three major groups: Annex 1, Annex 2, and non-Annex 1. Annex 1 talks about the developed countries which have to take binding. Annex 2 talks about the developed countries which have to provide a technical and financial assistance. And non-Annex 1 countries are the developing countries where they do not have any bindings, but they can receive the financial assistance for their contribution to the climate change issues. Now the question was, which group of countries in Annex 1 have to take the binding and which greenhouse gases they have to reduce? And for that they created something called as Annex A and Annex B. Annex A talks about the particular greenhouse gases whose binding has to be taken, and Annex B talks about the particular countries of Annex 1 who have to take the binding of greenhouse gas emission. Very technical. Read them carefully with calm and composed mind. So that is sufficient for you to understand. Is it clear? So this is something which we refer them as two annexes of the same, right? Now you can have a break of 15 minutes. Then we'll start the class at 7:15. We'll start the class at 7:15. Is that drawbacks will be there. So as there were drawbacks, so that's why we moved to the Paris Agreement. So we'll discuss drawbacks, but first understand what this concept is, what this talks about. Then briefly we will discuss the drawback, and then we will say discuss why we moved on from Kyoto Protocol to Paris Agreement. Why was the need to shift from first strategy to the second strategy? Every time when you talk about every time whenever when we talk about any types of these, so in the current affairs we always come across Paris Agreement and their part. So Paris Agreement is a second strategy. Paris Agreement is a second strategy. It has entered. Why? Because first strategy was failure. First strategy was unable to find a solution for climate change, so we have dropped the first strategy, and in place of that, from 2020, this Kyoto Protocol is replaced by Paris Agreement. Kyoto Protocol is replaced by Paris Agreement. From when? 2020. Now here we will try to understand what this Kyoto Protocol talks about. Then we will discuss why we moved on to Paris Agreement. Is it clear? Annexed to countries, they do not have any binding. Annexed to countries, they have to provide technical and financial assistance. Only Annex 1 countries have to take binding. Only Annex 1 countries have to take binding. Is that clear? So we'll meet up at 7:15. Welcome back after the break. So hope I'm audible as well as visible to you all, right? So please confirm that I'm audible as well as visible to you all. Done. Don't get much confused. So these are the factual data. So you should remember Annex 1, Annex 2, then Annex A and Annex B, right? Now, how this entire Kyoto Protocol works, how this entire Kyoto Protocol works or Kyoto mechanism work. This Kyoto mechanism is also referred as flexible mechanism, where it makes the countries to meet their emission targets. Which countries? Annex B countries. And it encourages the private sectors and developing countries to contribute in the context of reducing the impact of climate change. And this created three market-based mechanisms. They are referred as international emission trading, then clean development mechanism, and joint implementation. Please remember these three terms. It created three market-based mechanisms: international emission trading, clean development mechanism, and joint implementation. So what all the three terms mean? Now understand this. In the context of Kyoto Protocol, it introduced a concept. Called as assigned amount units. Assigned amount unit, or it is also referred as Kyoto unit or Kyoto unit. Both are same, assigned amount unit or Kyoto unit. And the value of this assigned amount unit or Kyoto unit is 1 ton of carbon dioxide, or 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Assigned amount unit or Kyoto unit, which is having 1 ton of carbon dioxide or 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2e. And this is also referred as something called as carbon credit. This is also referred as carbon credit. Right. So 1 Kyoto unit or 1 carbon credit or 1 assigned amount of unit is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide or 1 ton of CO2e. So please remember, 1 carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide or 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. 1 carbon credit. And this carbon credit has financial values. This carbon credit, it has financial values. Or it is tradable certificate or tradable permit. It is tradable permit or it is tradable certificate. Tradable permit or tradable certificate, which can be sold or purchased in the international market. Which can be sold and purchased, not in the national, in the international markets. Sold and purchased in the international market. And this mechanism, where the carbon credits are sold and purchased in the international market, we refer that as carbon trade. We refer this as carbon trade. Carbon trade. And now you should remember, any Annex B country which holds the carbon credit it has a right to emit greenhouse gas emission. So any country which holds the carbon credit. So any country means a developed country, because developing countries, they do not have any binding. Any country which holds the carbon credit, it will have right to emit the greenhouse gas of the value which it is holding, of the value of the carbon credit. Any country which holds the carbon credit, it has a right to emit the amount of greenhouse gas, amount of carbon dioxide, what it is holding. So this aspect of selling, buying, or purchasing of the carbon credit is referred as carbon trade. Now, how this mechanism is worked? So please understand this term now, carbon credit, and how the carbon trade is performed, which country and how they will be benefiting to that. Now, understand this, very simple, understand this. Which countries have to take the binding? Annex B countries have to take the binding of emission of greenhouse gas. So according to Kyoto Protocol, 37 plus 1 countries, they are to take the binding of emission of greenhouse gas. So these countries, they always have limit to emit greenhouse gas. They always have limit to emit the greenhouse gas. Binding means they have to limit the greenhouse gas emission, and this limit is given every year. So this is every year. So they have to limit the assigned units only. They have to emit the assigned unit of greenhouse gas. So they can't exceed beyond that. These greenhouse gases, they have to be emitted only which has been assigned by United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So UNFCCC, by taking scientific aspect, it assigns to the developed countries that they have to emit only the assigned value of the greenhouse gas, not beyond that. Every year it is fixed. They have to take up the binding, and within that they have to emit the greenhouse gas. Now take this example. If you're talking about, say, 2010, in the year 2010. Now the countries which have to take the binding are Annex B countries. Annex B countries have to take the binding, which are developed countries. Now this is a Annex B. This is Annex B. Say Annex B country. Example, this is country A. Country A, which is Annex B, a developed country. And one more Annex B country is there. One more Annex B country. We refer this as country C. Now, these countries, they will be having a binding of emission of greenhouse gas. Now, the country A, for the term 2010, it has the binding. It can emit, say, around 15 units of greenhouse gas. It can emit 15 units of greenhouse gas. So that is assigned value. So 15 units of greenhouse gas can be emitted by Annex B country for the year 2010. Now for Annex B country, it is having 10 units of greenhouse gases it can emit. So the assigned values are not same. They differ on the basis of their historic emission, they differ on the basis of their contribution in the environmental concern, and they differ on the basis of their population. So many criteria are there. No, you don't have to by heart all the criteria, just understand the process. So in the year 2010, Annex B country has been assigned with 15 units of greenhouse gas they can emit, and Annex B, another country C, which has assigned 10 units of greenhouse gas which can emit during that 2010. That is January to December. January to December. Right. Now, in the context of this, C is a country, man. C means it is a country. Example, A, any country, C is any country. Example, any country. It can be any country for that matter. Any country of this 37. C is an example. A is example, C is also example of any country. Now, if you take the criteria, by the month of November, Annex B country, that is A country, A of Annex B has utilized its 14 units, has used its 14 units. So it means that it has almost all used all the units which it has absorbed, which has been assigned to that. Whereas the country C, in the month of November, it has used only 4 units. It has used only 4 units. So 6 units are pending with that. And in the country A of Annex B, it has already used 14 units. So it means that only 1 unit is left out. So in this case, the country A of Annex B, it can't stop its economic activities. It can't stop its industries because of dearth of the assigned values. So what it will do? It will purchase the carbon credits. So the country B will purchase the carbon credits. Now here, it can purchase the carbon credits either from a developed country. So this country A can purchase it from another country, that is country C, which is developed country, which is also developed country. Or another group of countries are there which are referred as developing countries. Now these developing countries are like India, Brazil, etc. Now they don't have any binding. So these countries have no binding of emission of greenhouse gas. But these countries, developing countries, they have taken the work like afforestation. They have taken the work like solar energy projects, etc., or electric vehicles, etc. By taking these types of works, afforestation, solar energies, electric vehicles, etc. So these countries have developed their carbon credits. So these countries have developed the carbon credits. By taking afforestation, by taking solar energy projects, by taking many methodologies, they have proved that this amount of carbon dioxide we have removed from the atmosphere. This amount of clean energy we have introduced into the Earth's economic activities. So by that, we have worked very strongly in reducing the greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, or we have contributed in clean energies. So by that, we have created or we have developed the carbon credits. So developing countries creates the carbon credits by taking the activities like afforestation, clean energy projects, solar energy projects, electric vehicles in their strategies, etc. So they also create their carbon credits. So these developing countries will also have carbon credits like India, Brazil, etc. Now this country A of Annex B, it can purchase it either from another developed country, or this country A, it can purchase it from developing country. So it is having two possibilities. It can purchase it from a developing country, or it can purchase it from another developed countries. And this developed country, it is having surplus credits with it, so it can sell them. It can sell the carbon credit to that. So country C here, it will sell the carbon credit, and country A will purchase that. So it is between one developed country and another developed country. So this trade between the two developed countries, this trade which is between the two developed countries, that is A and C, is referred as joint implementation. The name given to the trade between the two developed countries is referred as joint implementation. Joint implementation. And here the carbon credits which are sold and purchased. So in the joint implementation, the carbon credits which are sold and purchased, which are traded, the carbon credits which are traded, they are referred by a name. They are referred by a name. The carbon credits which are traded between the two developed countries, that is joint implementation, is referred as emission reduction units. Is referred as emission reduction units, or ERU. If it is the trade between two developed countries, we refer that as joint implementation, and the carbon credits which are traded, we refer them as emission reduction units. Now, if a developed country, that is A, has purchased the carbon credit from developing country, so it is a trade. It is a trade between a developed country and a developing country. So this trade between the developed country and developing country is referred as clean development mechanism. So this is called as clean development mechanism. A technical term, CDM. Clean development mechanism. And here the carbon credits which are traded, which are purchased and which are traded, is referred as certified emission reduction. We refer them as certified emission reduction, or we refer them as CER. So remember, in this I have told about two types of carbon credits. So one carbon credit is referred as emission reduction unit, and this emission reduction unit is a carbon credit which is traded between the two developed countries. And the second one is certified emission reduction. Certified emission reduction is a carbon credit which is traded between a developed country and developing country. Developed country and developing country. So these are referred as the trades. See, Annex B countries can also make their contribution. Annex B countries can also. So here, this Annex B has made contributions. This Annex B has also made. So they can also provide. They can also create carbon credits. So Annex B has created more amount of afforestation activities by which it is absorbing the amount of carbon dioxide as well. So they can also take up. They can also take up, and hence they can also create their carbon credit and they can sell. They can also sell that. Is it clear? So the idea is to understand the terminologies. Developed countries can also create carbon credits by taking these activities. Developing countries can also create carbon credits by taking these activities. But the difference is developed countries have the targets. The developing countries have no targets. They can perform. And if the developed countries, that is Annex B country, where the assigned values are ending up, it can purchase it either from another developed country or it can purchase it from a developing country. If it is purchasing from another developed country, then we refer that trade as joint implementation. And if it is purchasing from a developing country, we name that trade as clean development mechanism. And in the joint implementation, the carbon credits which are traded, we refer them as emission reduction units. And in the context of clean development mechanism, the carbon credits which are traded, we refer them as certified emission reduction. Is it clear? Now tell me, the carbon credits which are developed by India, the carbon credits which are developed by India by taking afforestation activity or taking up of solar energy project, can we call it as CER or ERU? The carbon credit which is developed by India, the carbon credit which is developed by India, can we call it as emission reduction unit or certified emission reduction? Right. Simple as it is. So it is called as certified emission reduction. So CER are developed by the developing countries and ERUs are by the developed countries. So when there is a trade between two developed countries, we refer that as joint implementation. And when there is a trade between developed and developing, we refer that as a clean development mechanism. And in the joint implementation, emission reduction units are traded, and in clean development mechanism, certified emission reductions are traded. Simple as it is. Right. So here it is about assigning and making the trade, assigning the values to the Annex B countries and then making the feasibility of trade. And hence it is called as cap and trade. So hence it is called as cap and trade. Cap is given to Annex B countries. Cap. The quotas are fixed to the Annex B countries and then they are made to trade and provide technical and financial assistance to the developing countries as well. So this all is referred as international emission trading. So this all is referred as international emission trading. This entire thing is international emission trading. International emission trading. Right. And the one which is done between the developed is joint implementation and the second one is clean development mechanism. So remember these. So it is international emission trading, clean development mechanism and joint implementation. Emission reduction units between developing ERU will not be between developing, it is between two developed countries. So remember, in the context of joint implementation, it is between the two developed countries. Both countries are developed countries. And here the trading is done with emission reduction units. So here you don't have any developing countries. But if you take the clean development mechanism, in the clean development mechanism, it is a trade between one developed country and one developing country. So it is one developed country and another is a developing country. So clean development mechanism is between developed and developing country. And here the carbon credits which are purchased and sold, we refer them as certified emission reductions. CER. Is that clear? So don't get confused. Ankush, don't get confused. So clean development mechanism is a trade between developed and developing. Joint implementation is a trade between two developed countries. Right. And in the joint implementation, it is emission reduction units are traded. Whereas in the clean development mechanism, it is certified emission reductions are traded. Now, the developing countries will always create CER and the developed countries will always create emission reduction units. At least you can remember this. Developed and developing. And this entire trade is referred as international emission trading, or we refer that as cap and trade. We refer this as cap and trade. Cap and trade. Is that clear? So please remember this. Assigned amount units. Go through that very slowly. And this is the mechanism. So here you don't have to remember all this, just understand the terms. What is clean development mechanism? What is joint implementation? What are certified emission reductions, and what are emission reduction units? If you remember the terms, that is more than sufficient in the context of your UPSC preparation, right? Now these are the terms: carbon credit, then certified emission reductions, then emission reduction units. Now the developed countries which are providing financial assistance to the developing countries for their environmental degradation which they have done in their areas, we refer that as carbon offset. Compensating for the losses what they have done in their areas, for that they provide financial assistance to the developing countries or any developed country. We refer that as carbon offset. We refer that as carbon offsetting. Compensating for the carbon dioxide pollution by preventing them in some other country, we refer that as carbon offsetting. Is that clear? So I have explained these. I have explained about these terms. So please read them and keep into the aspect. Is that clear? Now all the aspects of the clean development mechanism played very important aspect. The clean development mechanism plays very important aspect. So the objective of clean development mechanism is that clean development means the trade between developed and developing country. Developed and developing country. So here it helps the developed countries to fulfill their commitment for reducing greenhouse gas emission. That is binding of there. And it also provides financial assistance to the developing countries. It also provides financial assistance to the developing countries. How? By purchasing. How? By purchasing the carbon credit. Purchasing the carbon credit. Now, which carbon credit they purchase here? Which carbon credits they purchase here? In CDM. Which carbon credits they purchase here? So there are two types are there: CER and ERU. Right. So here they purchase certified emission reductions. So they purchase certified emission reduction. Is it clear? Certified emission reductions are traded in this. Now, during the same time, they created a fund called as adaptation fund. Adaptation fund. Now, what is adaptation fund? Adaptation fund is the fund which finances the projects and programs to the developing countries which are vulnerable in the context of climate change. Vulnerable communities or developing countries which are affected by the climate change. Now the impact of climate change we have already seen, like floods, droughts, submergence, health issues, etc. So it provides financial assistance to the projects and programs to the vulnerable countries, poor countries, developing countries, to adapt to the impact of climate change. And that fund is referred as adaptation fund. That fund is referred as adaptation fund. Now, here you should remember the contribution to the adaptation fund. Contribution to the adaptation fund is two ways. The first one is volunteer contribution. Any person, any country, any institution can voluntarily contribute to that. No forcible. Volunteer contribution. Any country, any institution, any person can volunteer contribute to that. Plus 2% of proceedings of CER. 2% of proceedings. Proceeding means sale. Proceeding means sale of certified emission reduction. So if the certified emission reduction which is traded in CDM, if it has raised 100 rupees, 2% will go to the adaptation fund. Example, if the certified emission, one certified emission is sold for 100 rupees, 2 rupees will go to the adaptation fund. So that is the meaning of the 2%. So 2% of proceedings of the certified emission reduction will go to the adaptation fund, not from joint implementation, not from emission reduction unit. Don't get confused. Don't get confused. It is not from emission reduction unit. It is only from certified emission reduction. Is that clear? Right. So this is all about Kyoto Protocol and the concern perspectives. Now, next we move on to something called as Paris Agreement. Now, before moving down to the Paris Agreement, understand a part. Kyoto Protocol is referred as the first strategy to the solution of climate change. First strategy to the solution of climate change. And what is the strategy? It is binding of greenhouse gas emission. It is binding, reducing through binding of greenhouse gas emission gas, right? So we refer that as first strategy. And here, when we analyzed the binding of greenhouse gas emission, it has two commitment periods. The first commitment, it talks about reducing 5% of 1990 value. 5% of 1990 value in between 2008 and 2012. It was partially achieved. And the second commitment period was reducing 18% of 1990 level by 2013 to 2020. It never entered into force. So this never entered into force. So it means that it was a sort of a failure. Right. Then here the developed countries and developing countries, if you take the data, only 37 plus 1 countries were taken the bindings. So these countries raised their objections if you reach to this region. So if you take this 2013, 2015, right? So then these countries, they raised their voices that why bindings is given only for few countries? Why binding for only these countries? Only few countries. They say that many countries are there which are major emitters, like China, which is emitting more. They also talk about countries like India, which are also emitting recently. Why the binding is not given to countries like China? Why they are still emitting greenhouse gases? Why you are not consider them as binding? So many such questions were raised. And that is the reason why they decided that this Kyoto Protocol is not going to make any type of success. So hence they decided that we have to find a new strategy. Or second strategy. And this second strategy will be something which can replace the Kyoto Protocol. Second strategy or new strategy which can make some correction which have been done in the Kyoto Protocol. So hence this new strategy is in the form of Paris Agreement. And this Paris Agreement is something which has replaced the Kyoto Protocol. Paris Agreement which has replaced the Kyoto Protocol from 2020, post 2020. So we made a complete understanding of Kyoto Protocol. Now we will move on to understand what is the second strategy. Which is referred as the Paris Agreement. Is that clear now? So we have moved on to the second strategy called as Paris Agreement. Now we'll try to understand what is this Paris Agreement. Is that clear? Which has replaced the Kyoto Protocol from 2020. Now the Paris Agreement was seen. Paris Agreement was seen in the year 2015. It started from 2015. So in the year 2015, which we refer them as Conference of Parties of 21, which was held in Paris, which was held in the Paris of France. And the outcome of this is referred as Paris Agreement. Outcome of this is called as Paris Agreement. Right. Now, Paris Agreement is again legally binding. Paris Agreement is legally binding. Legally binding. Now, what Paris Agreement says? It is not about binding of greenhouse gas. It is not about binding of greenhouse gas. Right. It says that all the countries should contribute. Developed country and developing countries. Every country should contribute in the context of climate change. And here it has made a significant assistance that the average temperature of the earth, which has been increasing since from pre-industrial era. Now, pre-industrial era means 1850 to 1900. So here they say that we have to limit the global temperature, which is rising, compared to pre-industrial level. So pre-industrial level means 1850 to 1900. We have to limit the global temperature to less than 2 degrees centigrade compared to 1850 and 1900 level. We refer that as pre-industrial level, or if possible to 1.5. So reduce the average temperature to below 2 degrees centigrade, below 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial level, or if possible keep it to 1.5, if possible to 1.5 degree centigrade above the pre-industrial level. So we refer that as 2 degrees Paris Agreement. So we refer that as 2 degrees Paris Agreement. Now here it talks about that something called as differentiated responsibilities. So what is differentiated responsibilities? Who has to contribute to the financial assistance? The developed countries. So hence it says that as a part of differentiated responsibilities, developed countries have to provide $100 billion every year, $100 billion every year in climate finance from 2020. Differentiated responsibilities. Every year, the developed countries have to provide $100 billion to the developing countries. This is called as the climatic finance. Climate finance. So remember, $100 billion. $100 billion every year to the developing countries. Plus, it asked all the countries of the world, whether it is developed country or developing country, all the countries, developed or developing countries, both the countries, not to take binding of greenhouse gas, but you give your strategies that how you are going to reduce the climate change. It asks the countries, all the developed countries and developing countries, to provide their strategies, give their strategies, provide what type of policies they are taking, what type of technological issues they are taking, what type of commitments they are doing, what type of blueprints they are doing, what type of blueprints they are taking towards reducing of the climate change. And this is referred as intended national determined contribution. So it asked all the countries, developed countries and developing countries, to provide their strategies, what they have decided, what they will be doing to reduce the climate change issues. And remember, these which are given, INDCs, intended national determined contributions. So whatever they are giving, they should be voluntary. They are voluntary. Even though the Paris Agreement is binding, INDCs are not binding. they have their own freedom to give their INDCs. They have their own freedom to give their NDCs. Any country can give whatever type of proportion they are doing. So national determined contributions, they are not binding. So please keep this in the mind. You can't force India to say that this amount of policy you have to do. You can't force Pakistan to say that this is the amount of policy you have to do. You can't force any developed country to reduce its impact here. So even though the Paris Agreement is binding, NDCs are non-binding. The countries have their own freedom to provide their own approach in the context of providing their policies. So please remember this. Paris Agreement is binding, but intended national determined contributions are not binding. And it has asked all the countries in the year 2015 to submit their intended national contribution by 2018. Submit them by 2018. And again, I am telling, these national determined contributions are not binding. Every country can give their own independent policies in that regard. Is that clear? And then it says that once you are submitted your approaches, we have to make the assessment of that. And this assessment will be done once in every 5 years. So as they have submitted in the year 2018, so the assessment will be done once in 5 years. So the first assessment will be in the year 2023, and we refer that as global stock take. That is assessment of NDCs. Assessment of NDCs. That is how they are performed, where we have reached, what drawbacks are there. We refer that as global stock take. So assessment of NDCs or global stock take will take once in 5 years. Once in 5 years. So hence the first global stock take was in the year 2023. And this was done in Saudi Arabia. This was done in Saudi Arabia. Last year, the first global stock take assessment was done in the COP28. We'll discuss what are the outcomes of the assessment. So please remember this. So it means that it created a sort of transparency. It created accountability. It created something, ownership, which is given to the countries so that they can provide their policies in the context of climate change. Right. Now here you should remember one more small term. Before 2018, they are referred as intended national determined contributions. So once they submit, once the INDCs are submitted, then they become binding. Once the INDCs are submitted, we refer that as NDC. Then they become binding. So please remember this. Please remember this. Very complicated. So the deadline is 2018. Where they submitted. So before that, before 2018, that is from 2015 to 2018. So there we refer them as intended national determined contributions. National determined contributions are non-legally binding. Non-legally binding. They can do their own policies, but once they are submitted, once they are submitted in the year 2018, now they are referred as national determined contribution. I is removed from that. Now we refer them as national determined contribution. Now once you have submitted national determined contribution, once you have accepted that I'll be doing, then NDCs will be legally binding. Then these NDCs will be legally binding. Legally binding. It is something like this. This is something like this. A person A, he has his own choice to say that I'll be doing these many duties. He will say that I'll be doing these many duties. You can't force him to do what type of duties. He will say set of duties what he will be doing, and then he will submit that. He will submit that. So once he has submitted, so before submitting, they're not legally binding. He can perform any type of activities. There is no binding to that. But the moment when he has submitted, then he has to abide. He has to do what he has referred in that. He has to do what he has given here. So hence, before 2018, that is, intended national determined contributions are non-legally binding. It means they are voluntary in nature. They are voluntary in nature. But once they are submitted, then they are referred as legally binding. They are referred as legally binding. So please understand the difference. Now we don't have INDCs. We refer them as NDC, National Determined Contribution. So now whatever submissions are there, we refer them as NDCs now, because the deadline has been completed by the year 2018. Right. So you have to, because they are mandatory. NDCs are mandatory. Every country has to give, which is referred as second strategy. Your submission is mandatory. What you take is not mandatory. Your submission is mandatory. And once you are submitted, then you have to follow that policy. So please remember these things. NDC. So at present, we refer them as NDCs. Right. So hence, this Paris Agreement is very important, where 5-year assessment is done. So it means it talks about transparency. It talks about accountability. And it also talks about NDCs, national determined contributions, which has to be submitted. Without that, it will not move. And the deadline given was 2018. All the countries have to submit their national determined contribution. So please keep this in the mind. So when you are reading that, you should remember these things. Right. So this is about the main aspect of Paris Agreement. Now, during the Paris Agreement, one more important event was done, which is referred as the launching of International Solar Alliance. And this International Solar Alliance was launched by India. It was launched by India along with France. And the objective of International Solar Alliance is to create a global deployment of 1,000 gigawatts of solar generation capacity and mobilize $1,000 billion of solar energy, money in the solar energy. So it is referred as clean energy. Initiatives which have been done by government of India. And it was launched during the Paris Agreement. Now, at present, the headquarters of International Solar Alliance is in India. That is Gurugram. Now, when it was launched, that is in the Paris Agreement, when it was launched. So only the tropical countries were eligible for membership. But a systematic change has been introduced. It was amended in the year 2020. So after 2020, it says that any country which is member of United Nations is eligible for the membership of International Solar Alliance. So major thing was introduced in the year 2020. So any country which is not the member of which is the member of United Nations, even though if it is outside the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, they can become the membership of that. And it has a slogan called as one sun, one world, and one grid. One sun, one world, and one grid. One sun, one world, and one grid. right? So please remember this. Now, when we talk about the one sun, one world, and one grid, so it talks about global access of clean energy. It talks about global access of clean energy. And here, clean energy means we talk about solar energy. And it is also something to unite a world. Unite a world. So this is something which you have to remember in the context of International Solar Alliance, and which was launched during Paris Agreement. And it is initiative of India. Initiative of India. And continuously it has been updated. In the year 2023, last year, many parameters have been included. So in the year 2023, they introduced a concept of mini grids. They introduced a concept of mini grids. Mini grids were introduced so that universalization of energy excess is done. They can be transmitted from one to another. So mini grids were introduced to transfer the solar energy. And it also talks about mobilizing more financial resources. Mobilizing more financial resources. Mobilizing more financial resources. Right. So this is some rough idea about the International Solar Alliance, ISA. Right. Yes, Surya Putra, International Solar Alliance, or what we refer that as one soul, one world, and one grid. Right. So initially, only the tropical countries were there, but after 2020, any country which is the member of United Nations is eligible to become a part of International Solar Alliance. And after that, UK and many other countries have joined. United Kingdom, which is not a tropical country, is a part of the International Solar Alliance. And hence, in the COP26, it highlighted its stronger role. In the year 2021, COP26, where it was held, it highlighted a tremendous role of United Kingdom. So United Kingdom is also collaborating with India in the context of clean energy. Mini grid means small grids where they can connect. Grids are the area from where the accumulation of solar energy is done, and from there it is transmitted. From there where it is transmitted, even to the non-tropical countries. Through mini grid, it is transmitted even to non-tropical countries. It can be transmitted to even non-tropical countries. Grid, it is like a platform from where it is transmitted. Right. Now, India submitted its national determined contribution in the year 2018. Now, it says that India will reduce its greenhouse gas emission, and it says that 40% of energy power capacity in India will be from non-fossil or clean energy. Clean energy. Then it also says that India will create an additional carbon sink of 3 billion. So it is creating through afforestation. Afforestation. So this is what the India's national determined contributions which were submitted in the year 2018. India's national part which were submitted in the 2018. Now we have to understand some more. So these are not the permanent one. As there were many issues with this, then these were asked to replace. These were asked to replace and restructure or modify. So hence, all the countries, they have to submit their modified national determined contribution. Right. So we'll discuss why they have to be given. But understand, they were modified. They were modified in the later stage. India's national determined contributions were modified in the later stage. We'll see them, how and what circumstances made them. So first understand this 2018 aspect. Right. Now, what is NDC? National determined contribution and its meaning. Right. Then it also created a green climate fund. Green Climate Fund in the year 2010. In the year 2010. And this Green Climate Fund, after the launching of Paris Agreement, it plays a significant role. It plays a significant role in implementing the Paris Agreement, right? So don't by heart all, just keep the terminologies into your access. If you remember the terminologies, then it is significantly understandable. So don't by heart anything, don't by heart anything in the context of your examination. Understand the flow, right? Now next is COP24 Katowice. Now the major idea in the Katowice is that Katowice is in the country called as Poland. It is in the Poland. Poland. Now this COP24, which is held in the Katowice, is for the third time. So Poland was hosting it for the third time. Katowice in the third time. So before that, it also held one in Warsaw and then Poznan. So this is the third conference which is held by Katowice of Poland. This is the third one. Right. Now, the major idea of the COP24 Katowice was, so in the year 2020, we were to apply the Paris Agreement. So to apply the Paris Agreement, we needed an operating manual. And that operating manual or rule book is very important. So in the COP24 Katowice, it was decided to develop, to create an operating manual for Paris Agreement. To create operating manual to implement Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement, which was proposed to be started from 2020. So they needed an operating manual, the strategies which has to be taken, the things which has to be done, which included the transferee framework. It talks about NDCs to be included in the countries list, mitigation and adaptation measures. So all these details were there. So it is referred as operating manual or rule book to implement the Paris Agreement. So that was the major discussion which was done in the COP24, that is Katowice, so that we will end up the Kyoto Protocol, and that Kyoto Protocol will be replaced by Paris Agreement. So we needed an operating manual post 2020. Operating manual post 2020. So that was the decision which was taken in the COP24 Katowice. Important one. Then COP25, which was held in Madrid in the year 2019. Now the major outcomes of this, aim to finalize the rule book of Paris Agreement was not done. No development was done. So this was not done. And the major problem was associated with the carbon market. Now understand this. Major problem was associated with the carbon market. Now what problem was? So many developing countries were there. Like India and Brazil, etc. So many developing countries, India, Brazil, etc. So they created a large amount of carbon credits. So these created a large amount of carbon credits. And these carbon credits, which were created by the developing countries, were unsold. So large amount of unsold carbon credits were there, which have to be traded in the international market. And they had large amount of unsold carbon credits were there in the year 2019. Now this created a major problem. Now the developing countries started questioning UNFCCC. Now the developing countries started questioning the developed countries. See, you told in the Kyoto Protocol that you create the carbon credits, we will purchase that. By that, you will get a financial assistance and technical assistance. And we accepted all your terminologies. We accepted whatever you are told. And based on that, we created carbon credits. We worked accordingly what you have told. And we worked in the context of climate change, what you are told. And we need a support from you people. And you told something, developed countries have told something, and based on that we have created carbon credit. Now suddenly you are telling that you're not creating certain a win-win situation for us. Now you are telling that these carbon credits are not important. We are moving down to something called as second policy called as Paris Agreement. Then the developing countries started raising the question. You say something in the first strategy and don't keep your promises. Then how we should believe that you will keep your promises which you have made in the second strategy? How we will believe that you will keep promises what you have made in the Paris Agreement? So they stuck to the point that first you settle the carbon credit mechanism, first you settle the carbon market, first you settle the carbon trade issue which you are committed in Kyoto Protocol, or unless and until it is settled, we are not moving down to the Paris Agreement perspectives. So hence this carbon market or carbon trade issue was not settled. So there was no understanding between the developed country and developed country. So hence the setting up the rules for carbon market was also not done. So hence the COP25 Madrid is referred as failure. It was unable to perform the rule book, and it was unable to settle the carbon market. Yes, the developing countries were correct on their path. They say that you are told in the Kyoto Protocol and now you're not keeping your words. Then how I should believe that you will be keeping your Paris Agreement, what you are starting from 2020? First you settle the carbon trade. First you settle the carbon market. First you tell me what I should do with the carbon credit, what I should do with these carbon credit which are unsold, where I should put them, where I should use them. Then only it is easy for us to take a step in the context of Paris Agreement. So that was the argument which is done by the developed country and developing. So there was a deadlock between the developed and developing country with reference to the carbon trade. This was not settled, and hence the COP25 was a failure, right? Then we moved on to COP26, but before that, three terms are very, very important. Three terms are very, very important in the context of climate change. One is adaptation, mitigation, loss and damages. Now, the first one is adaptation. Be careful in understanding the term. Adaptation means it is a process of adjusting to the present, current, and future climate change by changing the behavior and system of life. By changing the behavior and system of life. How? Example is making the agriculture something called as organic farming. Changing in the behavior is doing organic farming. Then another example is the coastal countries, they will always have the issue with the floods and submergence. So they should adapt to the floods and submergence by constructing embankment or constructing or growing the mangroves. Construction of embankment, or growing the mangroves, so that the coastal inundation of the water will not be there. So you're adapting to that. Or you can take an example of water harvesting. So when you make the water harvesting, so what you are adapting? You are adapting to the drought-like conditions. Water harvesting. So if you retain the water, then during the drought, you will getting the water. So these are called as adaptation to the impact of climate change. So it is the measures what the developing countries are taking to reduce the impact of climate change at present, maybe due to drought, maybe due to floods, maybe due to forest fires. So we refer them as adaptation, process of adjusting to the current policies. It is present one. Changing your behavior, altering your behavior means you are moving from fossil fuels to clean energies. You are reusing the water. You are making sure that the solid waste is not thrown. You are managing the solid waste. So all these referred as altering the behavior. You change your behavior so that you can prepare to the impact of climate change. You prepare and adjust to the context of climate change. We refer that as adaptation. And this is present scenarios. Present scenarios. Now, the second one is mitigation. Mitigation is long-term process. Long-term process. That is, you have to reduce the emission of greenhouse gas. Mitigate, reduce that. Reduce the greenhouse gas emission. If you start working from now, maybe after 20 years, your carbon footprint will be less. Maybe after 20 years. Maybe after 20 years, your reduction or carbon footprint will be very low. Your carbon footprint will be less. Now, when your carbon footprint is less after 30 years, is it difficult to adapt or easy to adapt? Answer the statement. If you are reducing your greenhouse gas, if you are using clean energies, if you are discouraging the fossil fuels, then after 30 years, when the amount of greenhouse gas, amount of footprint which is emitted will be lesser. So in that condition, is it difficult to adapt or easy to adapt? That's what. So if you mitigate now, it will be easy to adapt in the later stage. Is that clear? So this will make easy to adapt. So easy to adapt in the later stage. Is that clear? So hence, you have to mitigate. So the first strategy is adapting. You adapt first. You first adapt that so that the losses will not be immense. Then, along with that, you should mitigate. Reduce your greenhouse gas emissions so that after 30 years, you will not be having the major problem with the adaptation. The cyclones will not be dangerous. The floods will not be dangerous. The droughts will not be dangerous because you're already prepared and already you're reducing the greenhouse gas emission. So we refer that as mitigation, adaptation, mitigation. Now the last one is in spite of adaptation and mitigation. In spite of adaptation and mitigation, when the losses occur, we refer that as loss and damage, right? So it is in spite of adaptation or mitigation. In spite of that, when the losses happen, we refer that as loss and damage. And this loss and damage can be economic damage or it can be non-economic damage. Non-economic damage. Destructive impact. So you have constructed a barrier. So in spite of barrier, the water has entered and destroyed. We refer that as loss and damage. You have made watershed management. In spite of that, the losses have taken. You have created the facilities. In spite of that, the losses are there. We refer that as loss and damage. So please remember these three terms. And they are always seen in the current affairs. Adaptation, mitigation. So we already has the adaptation and mitigation was there. Now this loss and damage was introduced in the last conference of parties where the countries demanded that we need a separate S&D. The developing countries demanded that we needed a separate loss and damage fund. Because till now, the loss and damage fund was included in the climatic finance. There was no separate fund was created. Recently, in 2023, in the year 2023, a separate fund was created called as loss and damage fund. So please remember these terminologies. Is that clear? Adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. Please remember the terms and their differences. Is that clear? Now, COP26, which is very important, Glasgow. And this was seen after the gap of 1 year because during the COVID, COP26 was postponed. Due to COVID, it was cancelled in the year 2020 and it was held in the year 2021. So COVID was there. And after the COVID, it was seen. Now here countries reaffirm the Paris Agreement. So whatever they have done in the Paris Agreement, they said that, yes, we will be doing that. We will be keeping the limit of 2 degrees centigrade. And if possible, we are keeping it to 1.5. Reaffirming means reconfirmation of Paris Agreement, which was in the COP26, 2021. Now this is very important. Here, for the first time, it says that countries agrees to the call for phasing down. So what do you mean by phasing down? Reducing them. Phasing down coal power. Phasing down, reducing the coal power. And they were very strong in phasing out, removing. Phasing out means removing the subsidies. Phasing out the inefficient fuel subsidies. Phasing out means completely removing. Removing. Right. When you remove the subsidies, the cost of the fossil fuels, will it increase or decrease? When you remove the subsidies, when you completely phase out the subsidies, the cost of the fossil fuels like coal, petrol, will it increase or decrease? Right. So it will increase. Now, when the cost increases, will you use them? When the cost increases, will you use them? No. So hence they say that we have to phase down the usage of the coal slowly. You can't stop the coal suddenly, but you can reduce the subsidies. You can phase out the subsidies. And once you have phased out the subsidies, the cost of the fossil fuels becomes very high. And if it is necessary, only in that condition, you will use that. So hence, make the fossil fuel more costlier by reducing subsidies. Make the fossil fuels more costlier by reducing the subsidies or phasing out the subsidies. So this is very important. Phasing down the coal and phasing out the subsidies. Phasing down the coal power and phasing out, removing the inefficient fossil subsidies. Right. Then a very positive is the completion of rule book of Paris Agreement was done. It was done. And the carbon trade was also settled. Carbon trade was settled. Now, what settlement was done? It told that the unsold carbon credits, which were developed or which were created, phased down means reducing slowly. 10 to 4, 10 to 3, we refer them as phasing down. 10 to 0 is phasing out. Is that clear? Petrol, diesel, like essential good for us. So when we say petrol, diesel are essential, so the what way you were using the petrol some 20 years back, are you using that? You will use the vehicle only when it is urgency. When you use the vehicle when it is urgency, not. So usage will be restricted. When the cost increases, the usage will be restricted. Is that clear? Now the carbon credit were settled. So unsold carbon credit, which were created between January 1, 2013 up to December 30, 2020. December 30, 2020. So these unsold carbon credit, which were created between January 1, 2013 to December 30, 2020, will be used. A country can use them. They can be used in their first cycle of national determined contribution. If nobody is purchasing them, you can show that I have used them in your own policies. I'll be using them in our own policies so that you can emit that greenhouse gas. So you can use them in your own policies. Is that clear? So use them in the first. So that's why the carbon trade was settled. And new national determined contributions were submitted. Now, before this, they told that the national determined contributions which were submitted in the year 2018 are not effective. So by keeping the NDCs, we can't reach Paris Agreement. So these 2018, we can't reach Paris Agreement. So hence it was told that all the countries, they should restructure or modify their NDCs and resubmit. So many countries resubmitted their NDCs. So countries started to resubmit their NDCs, right? And this is based on the philosophies of that they calculated. Now, which is the scientific agency which calculates the which is the agency which talks about the science-based data in the context of climate change. Science-based data. And this is something called as IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It has studied all the NDCs. And it says that these NDCs are something which are having defective. And hence it suggested that you have to restructure your NDC and submit that again. Right. So electric vehicles fame is given. Why? Because that electric vehicle is non-fossil. It is clean energy. So more subsidies are given to that. So hence the idea is to discourage the fossil fuel and encourage the clean energy. So it is to discourage the fossil fuel and encourage the clean energies. Encourage the clean energy. So that is the motto of that. So new NDCs were submitted according to that. Right. Then global methane pledge was done. Global methane pledge, where 103 countries, including 15 major emitters, they signed that 30% of global methane they will reduce by 2030. Now, remember, India is not part of that. India is not a part of that. India is not the part of pledge. India says that we are a developing country. We need more amount of methane production. We can't reduce the methane emission. So India is not a part of this global methane pledge. India has not signed that. Then it talks about halt and reverse the forest loss. That is, reduce the forest loss by 2030. And again, India is not a part of that. India is not a part of that. Why? Because India has already said that we have signed something called as land degradation neutrality. Why again one more I have to approach? Already we are taking land degradation neutrality. Why we have to move on to the halt and reverse? So India is not a part of methane pledge. India is not a part of halt and reverse forest because India says that we are the part of land degradation neutrality. We have taken land degradation neutrality by 2030. Now, there is no point in taking two targets. We already taken the target and we will work on that. Why we have to go on this? So that is their point of reference. And it is also something where they, for the first time, they decided that loss and damage has to be taken. So for the first time, the voice for loss and damage was taken. And this is called as something called as Glasgow Dialogue, where it decided that, yes, we have to make sure that the loss and damages should be taken as separate perspectives. Is it clear? So these are certain outcomes of COP26. COP26. Is it clear? And also funding for the adaptation was done. I told what is adaptation. I told what is adaptation. So this slide we will discuss tomorrow. I have to talk something about climate finance also. We'll discuss this tomorrow. Right. So don't get much stress. Read them, revise them. Many technical terms are there. If you revise them, if you understand them, then current affairs will become a cakewalk for you people. These all are basic foundations. If you are good enough in these basics, then current affairs will be a cakewalk for you people. Because here, if you understand what is adaptation, if you understand what is mitigation, then you can understand what is loss and damage. If you understand what is carbon credit, then you can understand what is carbon trade. If you understand CBDR, then you can write an answer why CBDR is not being there, why we find there is a breach of CBDR. When you talk about many type of subsidies, take an example of European countries. So European countries have made their own rules and regulations where they say that the goods which have to enter into the European part, so they have to pay the taxes. So when every country have to pay the taxes, which the goods prepared in India and all, now where is the CBDR? Where is the CBDR? Right. So we refer that as European carbon trade border arrangement or carbon tax adjustment, which is in. So there they tax that to reduce the impact of carbon dioxide or impact of greenhouse gas. They tax the goods which are entering into that. Now these goods are not only developed by developed countries, they are developed by developing countries. Now when India is developing the goods there, why India has to pay the tax for that? Because CBDR is not being validated. India is a developing country. Now, why it has to pay the tax for that? If the developed country is paying the tax, then no problem for that, where they are exporting. Why India has to pay the tax for that? Why developing country? So where is that CBDR? So hence such type of statements can be analyzed only when you are good enough in understanding CBDR philosophy and other aspects. So if your base is clear, then you can write anything in the context of your perspectives, right? So we'll end up the session here. So 5 minutes I've taken. So PPT is more than sufficient. Gunjan, PPT is more than sufficient, and keep the PPT as your skeleton. And wherever when you come about current affairs, From there, you can mix up that. That is more than sufficient. PPTs, they will create a huge impact. And any term where you are getting, you make them into your perspectives. Right. So we'll complete the session here. We'll meet up tomorrow at the same time at 5 p.m. Till then, take care and good night.